Good morning. Thank you. So that's a good example of what we're going to talk about, is the nature of communication, about well-being, about health, and about what Medicine X is inviting us to consider. So what I'd like to do is just invite you in this brief presentation to take a deep breath right now, collectively, and let's become present for what we're about to experience together. We're going to be speaking about three fundamental things, and as we go through the half hour together, we're going to trace what they have to do with medicine and health. The first we're going to talk about is relationships, what they are, why we need to have a revolution in the field of medicine so that we transform from the old patterns of thinking that there's an expert who gives their expertise to the receiver of that's called a patient, and instead think about this relationship as collaborative and what that actually means. So if someone comes on stage and says hello, we say back, hello. Yes, good. So it's about a connection, and if you've ever been up here and you say hello and no one ever says anything, you go, oh my God, this is really lonely. Because our relationships give us a sense of being seen, of feeling felt, of being connected. And in many ways, as we trace what we're about to talk about health, those are the fundamental ways we actually create well-being in our bodily lives. The second area we're going to talk about is the body. And in particular, one aspect of the body that everyone's all excited about is the brain. So we'll talk about the body and its brain, as well as relationships, and see what do they have to do with each other. And the third area that we're going to talk about is something that I'm particularly intrigued by, the fact that in all of the different disciplines that explore it, no one really offers a definition of what it is, and that's a word you may have heard about, and it's called mind, M-I-N-D. So we're going to be speaking about relationships. We're going to be talking about the brain and its body, or the body and its brain. My daughter says, don't say this, but I'll say it, the embodied brain. And she says, Dad, why would you say that? There's never a brain without a body, and she's right. But the idea is that we're going to look at especially the entirety of the body and the nervous system that helps regulate it. And then we'll talk about mind and what that is. Now, the reason to talk about this, because if you think about the presentation from the simpler folks, the idea that, let's say, gathering together, both physically here in this room and virtually for anyone who's participating in this conversation, we have the idea that there are those circles in the graph you saw, the nodes, and then there are the interconnections among the nodes. And in terms of our first topic, relationships, the way we define a relationship in the field I work in, which is called interpersonal neurobiology, and what we do in that field, interpersonal neurobiology, is we combine every discipline of science, mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, sociology, anthropology. We combine them all into one framework. And I've had the good fortune of working with colleagues where I've overseen the publication of 36 textbooks in this field. So we have a very rich library focusing on well-being, focusing on education, focusing on contemplation, lots of things. So everything I'm going to say is through the lens of science. So Dr. Chu mentioned, and Dr. Miner underlined the importance of it, that this is a scientific conference and we'll be drawing on the wisdom of science. And in particular, we're going to be using an approach called consilience, C-O-N-S-I-L-I-E-N-C-E. What consilience is it's an old English term that E.O. Wilson used as the title of a book he wrote years ago, which basically says, hey, what if we took the discoveries of separate pursuits and combine them together? So in interpersonal neurobiology, it's exactly what we do. We take a consilient view and say, hey, if math says this about systems and how that network works together, what is the physics of that? And when we live in bodies as we do, what's the chemistry of that? And since we're living beings, what's the biology of that? And since we have a mind, what's the psychology of it? And since we function in groups, what's the sociology of it? And since we have culture, we say, what's the anthropology of it? Honoring each of those pursuits. So what I'm going to do, because of course there's so much to say about this, is just give you the take-home messages and how they relate to health. So the first thing we need to do with relationships is say, why would we want a revolution in the field of medicine? Why is that necessary? And I'm going to begin with a story. It's a sad story, but I think it's important. When I was in medical school back in the late 70s, I'd actually been here as a college student just for a summer at Stanford in the cardiology department. And then I went off to Boston to go to medical school. And there, when I was in school, many of my professors had this interesting approach to patients, which is after they would get their lab data, they would walk with us, the medical students, into the patient's room, and they would say, I've received the results of your testing. You have a fatal disease, and you probably have 3 or 4 months. I'm sorry, goodbye. And when they would leave the room, I would tug on their, what's this called, a white coat, and I would say, don't you want to talk to the patient about how she feels? And attending after attending, and in retrospect, I don't really know what they were attending to, but attending after attending, the professors would say, why would I do that? I've tested what's going on in their bodies. I've given them the information they need. There's nothing more I can do. Now, let me ask you how you feel about that. If you were a young medical student, how would you take that in as what you were being taught by example of how to be as a participant in this dance of healing, to just say you're reporting on the physical nature of the body? These were very smart professors. This was Harvard University, and they were giving the data of the physical world. Well, ultimately, what I ended up doing was I ended up dropping out of school, thought about doing all sorts of other professions. But when I went back to school, I made up this word called mindsight back in 1980. And mindsight for me was the idea that we human beings, and perhaps all living beings, but let's just stay with our human cousins and brothers and sisters, that we have an internal subjective experience that is the fundamental nature of what we mean when we say mind. And that while we have a bunch of chemicals that make the structure of the body and all their interesting molecular combinations, something that is equivalent to the whole being greater than the sum of its parts is that the mind, at a minimum, has subjective experience, like what you feel when someone tells you you'll be dying in 3 to 4 months. You have an inner subjective core that is not the same as the molecular structure of your body. So mind is that, and the ability to see it is something that eyesight doesn't necessarily let you see. So mind sight is the ability, literally, of the mind to see itself. So it's insight into your own inner subjective world. It's empathy for the inner world of someone else. And as we'll see, the third component of mind sight is something that is a consilient finding across all the different disciplines, which is that well-being is dependent on a singular process. But I can't remember what it is. No, it's dependent on a process called integration. Integration, and this is now decades of trying to put together all these sciences into one view, that integration, which is defined as the linkage of differentiated parts, so that we're using the word integration in a very specific way, the linkage, the connection of differentiated parts of a system. Differentiating means you are able to combine different aspects of things together. That's the linkage of things that are unique, they're specialized. So, for example, in the system of medicine, then a patient has a differentiated role than a clinician, a nurse, an occupational therapist, a physician, than other third parties that are involved in the whole system. So we have differentiated roles, but we link, and you can look at integrated systems. And it turns out, amazingly, that when you look at this, so mindsight being insight into oneself, honoring the inner life of yourself, something that I, as a medical student, and sadly, when I go to different medical schools around the world, most medical schools never teach a physician student how to understand and heal their own inner life. So you can understand, I could tell you story after story about when I went back to school, what it was like to have this concept of mindsight back in 1980, to return to school and realize, these professors hadn't changed, but I used them as anti-role models. How to look at someone and say, that is not the way to do it. Now, strangely, 25 years, almost to the day, after I had decided to drop out of school, at Mass General Hospital, we used to have our classes in this room called the Ether Dome, which is not just that we're being etherized as medical students, but it was the first place that ether was used in modern medicine. Anyway, they asked me to come back, amazingly, because the school has changed a lot. They asked me to come back and give the keynote address to a series on neuroscience and medicine, and they asked me specifically to do this, to say the importance of emotion and narrative in medicine. And my son was there, he was 15 at the time, and I realized there I was, 25-year anniversary of dropping out, and now they wanted to know. And what was so striking about it, and now we have even more data than at that moment, is that we now have data to show, and this is just one scientific study, that if you take a patient with a common cold, otherwise well, comes in, sees a physician, primary care provider, and that physician, this is a double-blind study, so it's a control group that they did this with, and you have the physician just say, oh, these are your symptoms, I think you have a cold, this is what you need to do, goodbye, hope you get better, fine, perfectly nice, but attending to the physical world using physical sight. Versus someone who, in my terminology, would use mindsight. That is, they say, oh, you've got this symptom and that symptom. Aren't you a student here at Stanford? Yes. And isn't this May? Aren't you having final exams? Yeah. Oh my gosh, here's the 30-second difference in this group. This must be really difficult for you to be studying for exams and having this cold. Wow. It must be really tough. Now, toughness is a subjective experience. I understand this is a feeling of being challenged. So in that study, guess what happened? One group, you think about which one, got over their cold a day sooner, and their immune function was much more robust, even though it was just a 10-minute visit with a 30-second empathic comment that was made. Which group do you think got better faster? The empathic group, exactly. So what we can say now is that empathy is not a luxury for physicians. Empathy is a fundamental part of the system we're going to analyze. So to come to our first statement, relationships. Relationships can be defined as the sharing of energy and information. So when I've talked to different people who are relationship scientists or computer scientists who study the flow of information, all information is carried on energy. So it's not a non-scientific term. People in California get nervous when you're from a scientific background, you use the word energy, they think you're talking about something strange and unusual. If physics is a form of science, then energy is a scientific term. I mean, we talk to each other with the movement of air molecules. You can hear me. You can see me because of photons. A physician who puts her hand on a patient's hand when they're upset is using physical contact. That's energy. So the way we have a relationship is basically the sharing of energy. A subset of energy doesn't have information unless you speak gibberish. But a big subset that we're concerned about is how information, which is energy with meaning and symbolism, how energy patterns have meaning and symbolism extracted from them. That's information. In many ways, That's what our mental lives do. And I don't mean mental just meaning cognition versus emotion. I'm not using the word mind at all like that. Some people pit the mind against the heart, which makes no sense. Mind we're using as all subjective experience, all consciousness, and in this case, information processing. Does it use the brain? We'll get to in a moment. Yes. But relationships then are the sharing of energy and information flow. So what we can say is that medical care requires that we differentiate, that's where you can have your own inner subjective experience, and link. So the first statement we're saying on our first thing is that relationships that promote health are integrated relationships, honoring differences, promoting linkages. You as a physician or nurse or any other clinician, you don't become the patient, but you attune to their internal world. I have a bit of a problem, which I'm an acronym addict, and the one acronym I'll use today, and maybe another one will come up, I don't know, is the word PART. If you said, well, what's the part in a relationship that the medical professional needs to take, it would be the word PART, which stands for these 4 elements. P of PART stands for presence. We can now study the idea of a clinician or any human being present for another person. We have a whole book in our series about it that's about 400 pages long. There's a whole long line of scientific reasoning that's really fun and exciting to talk about, but the take-home message is this. You have a receptive state of your mind that allows you to receive things without judgment. Some people like to overlap with the concept of mindful awareness. So in our research center that I helped co-found at UCLA, where I do my clinical work, we know that mindful awareness is a way of developing presence. Now, presence allows for the second aspect of PART, which is A, and that's attunement. Attunement is the focusing of attention on the inner nature of a person. It's usually used to mean interpersonal attunement, but I believe that mindful awareness is actually a form of internal attunement. So attunement emerges from presence, so you tune into the internal nature of another person. That clinician who was giving that 30-second empathic comment was present to realize this was a student, attuned to the internal world, and probably did the third aspect of PART, which is R. What do you think it might be? Well, it's resonating. To resonate means, if I'm that clinician, I don't become my patient with the cold who's facing final exams. I feel their feelings. They change me because of what I'm experiencing in my attunement, because I'm present. So resonance is like a guitar string. You don't become the lower strings if you're a high string, but you resonate with them. And this is where the phrase, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, happens. Instead of 2 individuals in a clinical encounter, it becomes a we. This is everything. We is created from presence, attunement, and resonance. And what does it create? It creates the 4th aspect of PART. When you're present, attune, and resonate, literally in the nervous system of the individuals involved, and again, we have entire books devoted to this thing, trust. Trust is created as researcher Steve Porges has beautifully talked about. Something called the social engagement system is turned on, and all sorts of physiological things that Jaak Panksepp and Richie Davidson and all sorts of other people have talked about. I mean, if people say, why didn't you give references in your 30-minute talk? And I'd say, I'd be like this all the time with, Jones and Smith and Frank and Hilleman over here, and I'd be doing that. So there's references behind everything I'm saying. But this is a conversation, not a book. So you're not getting all the references, but these wonderful researchers throughout the world have told us basically, and when you rearrange what they found, presence, attunement, resonance, and trust is the fundamental part we play when a relationship is integrative and healing. So what does the body and brain have to do with this? Here's the amazing thing. The nervous system of the body, and this is going to be the fastest summary of developmental neuroscience and neuroplasticity you'll ever get. But here it goes. You ready? Number one, the nervous system begins as ectoderm in the conceptus. That is, you get a sperm and, I don't want to shock anyone, but you get a sperm and egg that get together. And then they get together and one cell becomes 2, 2, 4, and then 8 and 16, on and on, 32, 64, 128, all that, until finally there's a differentiation that has to happen because the glob of cells is so big, some are on the outside and some are on the inside. That's the first differentiation. But here's the amazing thing that happened. If this is the glob of cells, the cells from the skin layer, the ectoderm, invaginate inwardly to become the neural tube. And I'm just giving you that brief background to say that the nervous system began as skin cells. What's the skin about? The interface of the outer world and the inner world. And the nervous system, though it's embedded deep inside the body, is staying with its first philosophical stance. I will be the interface between the inner and the outer world. So it's cool to talk about the brain, not because it's up in the head, but because it's all about linking the outside and the inside. I love the term embodied brain, even though my daughter has a problem with it, because it just reminds us we never want to just talk about what's in the head. That's meaningless. It's bio-illogical. This nervous system is all about interfacing the entirety of the body with the entirety of the social surround. We are very social creatures. So, to put it really simply, integration that happens interpersonally turns out, and this took 20 years to figure this out, but it's incredibly simple. And when I revised my first book, The Developing Mind, I had 15 interns working with me, and I said, please prove these statements are wrong. Let's write a new book because that'll be more fun. And they thought I was nuts, and maybe I am nuts, but it turned out not for this reason. Here's the statement. Interpersonal integration stimulates the activity and growth of fibers in the brain that are integrative. Just to throw out 3 examples, the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum, for example, links the differentiated left and right side of the brain. The prefrontal cortex, if we do a hand model, let's do the quick hand model so you know what I'm talking about. If you reach under your chairs, Dr. Chu was really kind to tape a model of the brain underneath your chair that you can take home with you. If you reach underneath, he came in early this morning to do it, pull your hand out, you'll find the handout for today, which is you'll find a hand attached to your wrist. You everyone find that? Okay. So if you put your thumb, and you can take it home with you, never leave home without it. So if you put your thumb in the middle of your hand and put your fingers over the top, let's just do a quick review of this. I told you it's a fast thing of neurodevelopment. Your spinal cord will be represented in your wrist. If you lift up your cortex, the higher fingers, lift up your limbic area, we'll get to those in a moment. The brainstem is the deepest thing represented in your palm. Really old, 300 million years old. Put your thumb over, this is your limbic area. You'd have left and right thumb to be really a great, perfect model, but we'll do with one thumb. Limbic area, and then fold your fingers over the top. This is the cortex. The bottom line is how this complex system with 100 billion neurons up in the head and an average of 10,000 connections to each other, which is trillions of connections, the number of on-off firing patterns in this brain has been calculated to be 10 times 10, 1,000,000 times, which is a number larger than the atoms in the known universe. So what you have, even just up in your head, has more potential for firing than anything we know about. Now, of course, we are the ones saying it, so it could be a little bit of, being self-assured, but here's the deal about it. The way this complex system coordinates and balances itself is very simple. Differentiate and link. So the simple statement I'm going to say to you is that the 3 areas we just talked about as examples, the corpus callosum is linking left and right. The hippocampus links widely separated memory systems together, called implicit memory, into what's called explicit memory. And the prefrontal cortex, which would be these middle fingernails here, so it'll be in your head like this, basically links the whole thing together, the top, the middle, the bottom, and even the social world. So here's the statement. Interpersonal integration cultivates neural integration. We found tons of support for that, not a single piece of research to disprove it. So you never say in science, we've proven it, but there it is, let's repeat it. Interpersonal integration catalyzes or cultivates neural integration. Now, why is that important? Because what we know is that every form of regulation we've been able to look at, regulating attention, regulating emotion or affect, regulating mood, regulating thought, regulating even physiology, regulating your relationships and your behavior. All those terms come under the broad term self-regulation. Every aspect of regulation we could explore depends on integration in the brain. So here's one possible answer to the question, why did a 30-second empathic comment improve the immune system and make that person get better a day sooner? What's going on here? Is that magic? It's integration is what it is. We don't live in isolation. We live in connection with each other, as we'll explore in just a moment. So for the body part of all this, yes, we live in a body, and on that wonderful set of slides on our network, we would be considered in our bodies the nodes, those circles. Fine, we live in a body. That's a differentiated experience you have as an I. I live in this body, or maybe me. This is me, right here. Dan is here in this body. He's got a name. He's going to live hopefully about 100 years, and there you go. Okay. So with the body part, we know there's all sorts of things going on, amazingly, where what happens with your relationships, and we know this from here in California with the Adverse Childhood Experiences Scale study done at Kaiser, sadly, that relationship experiences that are stressful early in life lead to serious medical problems later on. Why? Because energy and information flow that happens relationally in the social world directly affects the molecular structure of the body. That's an amazing and important finding that we need to try to do more prevention in the world. That medicine isn't just about healing people when they're sick. It's about going out and saying, what's the mechanism going on here? Can we bring health even before the mechanisms begin of deterioration? So that's one thing to say. But the second thing to say is this. We don't live in separate ways. So now we're going to get to the third aspect of the talk before I stop in a few minutes. And that is the word mind. So we've defined relationships as the sharing of energy and information flow. We define the body as this collection of molecules in a system full of differentiated parts, and the nervous system is very important because when it's integrated, the whole body does well. But what is that nervous system really all about? It's the embodied mechanism of energy and information flow. So relationships are the sharing of energy and information. The body is the mechanism of that flow within the network called yourself, this little node of the network. What is the mind? Now, clearly in 5 minutes, I can't just say, well, here it is. Let's have a big discussion about it. So let me give you some take-home points. And in the book Mindsight or Developing Mind or the Pocket Guide to Interpersonal Neurobiology, if this is of interest to you, you can check those things out, or online at our Mindsight Institute. You'll find all this stuff discussed in huge detail. But here for this wrapping up the triad, we have relationships, body and brain, and then we have now mind. Here's the proposal. Number one, please be careful, because what I'm about to say is different from the non-statements you'll hear other places. That is, the only thing that's basically said in science these days about what the mind is people will say, very commonly, the mind is what the brain does. That is, mind is brain activity. And I think that's a part of the story, but if you limit it to that statement, which is very common in science to say it, you won't have a clue as to how the mind relates to medicine. So it's a part of the story. So through a long line of reasoning, here's a definition of mind I offered in 1992 to a set of 40 scientists I had assembled to discuss what is the connection between the mind and the brain. They couldn't come to any consensus because there was no definition short of brain activity, which didn't make an anthropologist happy. She would say, that's not true. It's not just brain activity. I study culture. So at our Center for Culture, Brain, and Development at UCLA, we've been studying literally how culture shapes synaptic formation in the brain. Because we don't believe the mind is just brain activity. Brain activity is an important part of it, but not alone. So here's the idea. If relationships are the sharing of energy and information flow, and the brain, if you will, is the embodied mechanism, that it's electrochemical energy transformations that sometimes contain symbolic meaning, so that's information. Energy and information is embodied, that's the nervous system, it's shared, relationships. What would the mind be? Here's the statement. If you look at this as what's called a complex system, here's the science of math. It's open, it's chaos capable, and it's nonlinear. So it meets the mathematical criteria of a complex system. All complex systems have what are called emergent properties. Emergent properties mean there's a property that arises from the interaction of the elements of the system that aren't found in the single aspects of the system. They come out of their interaction. That's called the emergence. It's not a California term, it's a math term. You always have to be careful when you're from California because people roll their eyes at you and it's like, okay, whatever. It's a math term. So here's the idea. One emergent property we're going to focus on now very briefly is called self-organization. My suggestion back in '92, that so far we've had just evidence to support and nothing to disprove it, is that the mind is the emergent, self-organizing, and here's the crucial part, embodied and relational process that regulates the flow of energy and information. So the mind, then, is a self-organizing process that is located where? Within you and between you. Not just you and other people, but you and the whole planet. The mind is a self-organizing, embodied and relational process that regulates energy and information flow. So what we know with this mind, if you look at the fantastic research done here in the Bay Area by Elizabeth Blackburn, and who got the Nobel Prize for discovering the telomerase system, and Alyssa Epel, is that presence, and Alyssa Epel and two of my interns and I just wrote a whole paper on this, presence leads to improvement in telomerase levels that repair and maintain the ends of your chromosomes. What you do with your mind in terms of presence, the first part of P, actually raises an enzyme level to repair and maintain the ends of your chromosomes to keep your cells healthy. Another set of studies, one is controversial these days, the other is pretty established, is that presence of mind in something called eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is the Greek term for well-being. It has a sense of connection to other people with compassion, meaning, and something called equanimity, which is achieving this sense of emotional balance. Equanimity. So equanimity, meaning, compassion, and connection, that's eudaimonia. Eudaimonia, which you can generate through mindfulness practice and all sorts of other things, is associated with changes in the non-DNA molecules that help prevent inflammatory diseases, some kinds of cancer, and some kinds of diabetes. So what you do with your mind actually changes the methyl groups and histones, the non-DNA molecules that sit on top of the DNA, altering its physical shape so that it changes its expression to optimize well-being. What you do with your mind, and notice these criteria, they're about a sense of connection to something larger than the bodily self. Compassion, feeling with another person, wanting to help them. Equanimity, being able to regulate your internal state. All those things, and even meaning, if you look at the developing mind as a discussion of the neurobiology of meaning, all those things relate to integration. So what I'd like to conclude with is this. In modern culture, we have made a serious mistake that is embedded in the way parents raise children, the way teachers have kids in school, the way the media is portraying something very, very vital to everything, which is the word self, S-E-L-F, self. We have equated the self with the body. And so when I was in medical school, knowing that a physician could just say, here's what's happening to the self of your body, You are dying. Goodbye. And we know now that that is not optimal medical practice. We have the science to show that's not the way to do it. Didn't feel right back then, but now we know scientifically it's not the thing to do. There is an internal subjective experience we have. Now, this statement that the self is in the body makes parents have kids compete with each other, because the idea is beat out that other self, so you can get into the best preschool you can get into, so you can get into the best elementary school and middle school and high school, because you want to try to get into the unbelievably best college you can, so you can get into the best graveyard. And everyone's like freaking out, right? Everyone is stressed beyond belief. And if you're a patient in all this, and I'll just say we had this powerful experience in medicine, because I'm so glad to be able to be here, but earlier this week, sadly, my father-in-law passed away after months of fighting a really downhill battle with heart disease. But he had some of the most connecting physicians and nurses you could imagine. And for my wife and I was her dad, for my wife and I to actually have the honor of being with my father-in-law when he was going through this end of his life, to have physicians and nurses who were so present for him, so attuned to him, so resonating with him. The trust that was created, it was just exquisite. Medicine can be that collaborative nature. So for our experience with my father-in-law, we could feel what I'm about to describe to you as a concept, but when it happens, you feel it. And that is when the self is not isolated just in the body. And you realize that the self is not just the node in that graph, the circle. The self is the node and all the interconnections. Now, we do have a differentiated experience of self. My father-in-law did. My wife and I did in this thing. Yes, you have a me, but there's also a we. So what I want to leave you with, just to contemplate, and that for us to have a conversation about in our interconnections of these bodily selves, is that we have a me and we have a we. And we don't want to give up the fact that you need to take care of your body. You need to be attuned to your body. You need to see what's going on in your body. Keep it healthy. Feed it well. Sleep it. Do all sorts of things with that body of yours. It's important as a me. But we also have an identity as a we. And we don't want to just say me to we. I used to talk like that. And one of my online students said, Dan, I'm really mad at you. And I said, what are you mad about? She goes, you're telling me to go from me to we. I said, well, yeah. She goes, but why? I need to be in touch with my body. I said, yeah, that's a differentiated self, but you want the other connecting part too. She goes, well, I don't want to drop me. I want to know who I am. I said, great. She goes, well, come up with another phrase. I said, okay, well, how about not only me, but also we? And she said, that doesn't rhyme. So I said, all right. How about this? I said to her, how about we? M-W-E. That an integrated identity allows you to have a differentiated me and a differentiated we, and when you put them together, it's a we. She goes, I love it. So what I want to leave you with is that when you really see integration happening in the mind and as a self-organizing process, the amazing thing is when this self-organizing process is not differentiating and linking, you either get chaos, rigidity, or both. It's amazing, and that explains actually all mental illness. But when you integrate, when you differentiate and link, you get harmony. You get flexibility, you're adaptive, you're holding together over time, called coherence, you're energized, you're stable, even in the face of the realities of life and getting older and facing death. So the amazing thing about integration for us in having this conversation in Medicine X is if we take the concept of integration and realize it happens within you and your body, it happens between you, and if you put the whole thing together as a we, here's what I'd like to leave you with. Integration, the fundamental basis of health, integration, when it's made visible, is kindness and compassion. Thank you very much for your attention.